80 years ago, the war in Europe ended following the German surrender. However, it wasn't the end of the fighting and the dying. For all across Europe, pockets of German forces remained under arms, garrisoning territories captured by Hitler years before, and in some cases actually still fighting, notably in a few remaining pockets on the Eastern Front, where German soldiers were loath to surrender to the tender mercies of Stalin. It would take several weeks before all German forces completely surrendered. However, Allied troops continued to be killed or injured after VE Day, and most people have no idea of this fact. They were the last service personnel to die in the European theatre of operations, but are forgotten by history because they did so after the German surrender. The surrender of Nazi Germany had been a drawn-out affair. Once Hitler was dead on the 30th of April 1945, the German forces in fact fought resolutely on, particularly on the Eastern Front. The new leader of Germany, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, appointed Reich President by Hitler in his last will and testament, continued the hopeless struggle, largely so that he could evacuate troops and civilians trapped on the Baltic coast, in a huge effort by the German Navy to save them from the Soviets. However, individual German commanders had concluded some large-scale surrenders on the Western Front.
After General Admiral von Friedeberg, it is Infantry General Kinzel who signs. For them too, a long road is ending. A road that started with conquest and ends now in utter defeat. Field Marshal Montgomery. He signs not only for himself, for his armies, for England and her allies. He signs also for all those who ever marched with him and fell at 100 barricades, who died for all of us, that with peace we may build a wiser world.
The Reich President gave his permission to surrender early on the 7th of May. At 2:41 a.m. on the 7th of May, General Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces in a large packed room at Reims Technical College. The agreement would come into force at 11:01 p.m. Central European Time the next day, 8th of May 1945. As I've covered in other videos, Dönitz's government was allowed to continue to exist after the surrender for a further 3 weeks, headquartered at Flensburg in northern Germany, largely because Dönitz cooperated in disarming German forces in the region, helping the British deal with this massive logistical and time-consuming headache. Much has been written post-war about something called the National Redoubt in the Austrian and Bavarian Alps, a last-ditch Nazi stronghold where the regime planned to hold out into 1946. But in the end, this turned out to largely be a creation of Dr. Goebbels' propaganda ministry. US forces in fact overran the area of the National Redoubt fairly easily in the days before VE Day. However, there was one other area in Western Europe that gave General Eisenhower and the Allied command serious pause for thought, and had the potential to be a real national redoubt, and that was Norway. Occupied by the Germans since April 1940, Hitler had heavily fortified the Norwegian coastline as part of the Atlantic Wall, and garrisoned the country with very large numbers of troops to protect the supplies of iron ore, vital for armaments production flowing in from Sweden. Norway was also home to some of Dönitz's U-boat bases, and had also been an important production centre for heavy water, used in Nazi Germany's atomic weapons program. The Allies had mooted plans to invade Norway, but had focused instead on other areas of Europe. Norway, with its large size and rugged coastline and mountains, was a fearsome prospect. As World War II in Europe drew to a close, Dönitz had begun transferring personnel and U-boats to Norway, which was very safe in comparison with northern Germany. By early May 1945, the German forces in Norway stood at some 380,000 troops under the command of the 20th Mountain Army, led by General Böhmer. Also, a lot of U-boats were at bases on the coast, these U-boat bases consisting of massive bunkers. And amongst the U-boat types were fairly large numbers of the brand new and game-changing electro boats, 10 Type 21s and 17 Type 23s, plus various older types of U-boat. Allied ships continued to be sunk until the very last day of the war, with dozens of U-boats at sea when the end came. Norway might figure, Allied planners fretted, in some last-ditch stronghold plan of Dönitz's, should northern Germany fall to Allied forces. Hitler had consistently refused to transfer any of the large numbers of German troops from Norway to help stiffen the collapsing armies on the eastern and western fronts. Dönitz inherited the belief that Norway must be held at all costs. This attitude was seemingly confirmed when, on the 3rd of May 1945, Reich President Dönitz ordered that if Germany fell to the Allies, U-boats would continue to operate from Norway. Some in the Allied camp thought that Dönitz and his government might yet decamp to Norway and fight on from there, and with such large military resources at his disposal and strong anti-invasion defences, such a nightmare scenario could not be ruled out. However, in the event, Dönitz was in fact more interested in continuing Operation Hannibal, the Kriegsmarine's evacuation efforts, and on the 4th of May he issued orders to General Böhmer that no offensive actions were to be undertaken against Allied forces from Norway for the time being. The Allies, however, were taking no chances and had for years been working up contingency plans for dealing with German-occupied Norway. General Böhmer accepted the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany on the 8th of May 1945. But a force nonetheless had to actually enter German-occupied Norway, take the German surrender and disarm about 380,000 troops and make them prisoners of war. There was also the possibility that certain U-boat bases, which were heavily defended on the landward side, might not actually surrender. The British would be responsible for Norway, and they and their Canadian and Polish allies in 21st Army Group had advanced northwest into the Netherlands and northern Germany, fighting their last set-piece battle at the city of Hamburg, which had surrendered on the 3rd of May 1945. The British had their hands full garrisoning northwest Europe, including Denmark, where the Germans there had also likewise surrendered, and dealing with prisoners of war, not to mention millions of civilians subsisting in bombed-out towns and cities. Few forces were actually available to deal with the huge German force still under arms in Norway. The British officer given the job of securing Norway was General Sir Andrew Thorne. He had to rely heavily on the Norwegian resistance movement to help him, which had been augmented by over 100 Special Operations Executive agents who had parachuted into Norway. The Norwegian resistance, some 40,000 strong, was ordered to prevent German troops, in the event of a surrender, destroying or damaging key communication centres and other facilities before British troops could arrive to disarm them. The Germans had the potential, even when surrendering, to cause chaos. Thorne's main force consisted of the British 1st Airborne Division, but it was very under strength. Brigades were detached on other duties elsewhere, and it was hastily reinforced until it consisted of the 1st Air Landing Brigade, which were normally glider infantry and consisting of 3 infantry battalions, 1st Battalion the Border Regiment, 2nd Battalion the South Staffordshire Regiment, and the 7th Galloway Battalion King's Own Scottish Borderers, plus the 181st Air Landing Field Ambulance Royal Army Medical Corps. The 2nd Divisional formation was the Special Air Service Brigade, all parachute-trained SAS forces. And the 3rd element was an artillery brigade, formed from a miscellany of divisional troops. In total, the 1st Airborne Division amounted to only about 6,000 men, expected to deal with upwards of 380,000 Germans. If resistance was encountered, and it could not be ruled out, the British would have been extremely vulnerable. A plan codenamed Doomsday was written up and the 1st Airborne Division given its objectives. The way would be cleared for the insertion of the 1st Airborne Division by so-called heralds, specially selected Allied personnel who would enter Norway after the German surrender and liaise with both German military and diplomatic personnel in Norway, and would accompany them to visit various German airfields to ensure that local forces would not resist Allied aircraft and troops landing at them. Once the heralds had signalled Britain that the airfields were safe, Operation Doomsday would commence. The 1st Air Landing Brigade would be flown to Oslo, occupying the Norwegian capital, assisted by Force 134, which consisted of Norwegian soldiers who had been in Britain during the war. The Artillery Brigade would land at Stavanger, the Luftwaffe airfield there being closest to the UK. RAF fighters would also be based at Stavanger to protect supply planes coming in and out. The SAS Brigade would likewise land at Stavanger and would march to Kristiansand and occupy it. This port would then be taken over by the Royal Navy. It was envisioned that lifting the 1st Airborne Division into Norway would take at least 4 days. On the 8th of May 1945, a copy of the German unconditional surrender was delivered to General Böhmer in Oslo. Dönitz ordered that all German forces withdraw from all Norwegian towns and cities and the Swedish border area and gather in designated areas to be disarmed by British forces. Concurrently, all Nazi Party officials, security police and Gestapo were to be arrested, and the Norwegian resistance moved quickly to round up collaborators and traitors. The Doomsday Plan hit a snag. On the 8th of May, none of the heralds reported that the airfields were open to receive British aircraft. However, the next day, 9th of May, as the German High Command signed another instrument of surrender in Soviet-occupied Berlin, word was received from the heralds, and the first elements of Force 134 flew in to work with the Norwegian resistance, plus elements of the 1st Airborne Division and the Norwegian Parachute Company. In this Phase 1 of Doomsday, tragedy struck. 15 transport aircraft carrying the advance party took off, but only 14 arrived safely at Gardermoen Luftwaffe Base near Oslo and at Sola Luftwaffe Base near Stavanger. Due to time considerations, Phase 2 of the lift occurred from early on the 10th of May, with 76 Handy-Page Halifaxes bringing in the 1st Air Landing Brigade and Headquarters 1st Airborne Division, and 76 C-47 Dakotas landing the Artillery Brigade at Sola. Tragedy struck again during this phase. Phase 3 saw the SAS Brigade flown in, and on the 11th of May, stores and vehicles were flown into Gardermoen and Sola. No resistance was encountered from the Germans, but British personnel were nonetheless killed.
Across the Skagerrak to Oslo came the first British officers to receive the surrender of those Germans still in Norway. Oberst Kasch of the Wehrmacht meets British Air Commodore Darrow. The RAF meet old comrades, members of Norway's underground army. And the citizens of Oslo, as those of every other liberated country, went mad with joy to be rid at last of the German invader. Norwegian flags reappeared from every window. Until late into the night, the people danced and celebrated in the streets. Air Commodore Darrow decorates a woman patriot of Oslo. The pent-up emotions of 5 years now break their bounds. Norway again belongs to Norway. Norway is free.
A number of aircraft crashed due to poor weather conditions in Norway. A short Sterling of No. 196 Squadron of the RAF was destroyed near Gardermoen, killing 14 soldiers and 6 crew aboard. A second Sterling, this time from No. 190 Squadron, was lost, killing all aboard, including Air Vice Marshal James Scarlett Streatfeild, whose job it would have been to formally accept the German surrender in Norway. The wrecked plane wasn't found until the 21st of June 1945. In total, Operation Doomsday cost the lives of 34 officers and men of the 1st Airborne Division, plus 1 wounded, and the RAF lost 6 killed and 7 injured. That's 40 British and Australian servicemen killed in the days after VE Day. An unknown fact today and made all the more tragic precisely because peace had been declared across Europe. Assisting the disarming of the Germans were some 13,000 Norwegian police troops, men who had escaped from Norway to Sweden during the initial German invasion in 1940 and later had been trained and formed into organized police battalions. Their help was absolutely vital for the understrength British forces. The 1st Airborne Division remained in Norway until the end of the summer. The 7th of June 1945, King Haakon VII returned to his nation from exile in Britain. The 380,000 Germans were processed and many used to help clear munitions and mines. And then, after a while, the majority were shipped home. The Norwegians convened war crimes trials and also dealt with traitors, the most notorious, of course, being Vidkun Quisling, the puppet leader of Norway under the German occupation. He was executed. Overall, Operation Doomsday was a complete success and a good example of the kind of operations undertaken all over Europe by Allied troops in the days and weeks after VE Day. Forgotten today, but nonetheless vital work, and as Doomsday showed, dangerous work that resulted in the deaths of servicemen after the guns had apparently fallen silent. And I hope that on this 80th anniversary of VE Day, we pause and spare a thought for the victims of peace who died resolutely doing their duty of enforcing the German surrender. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.